Now, we understand as Marxists that one of the most important contributions made to the development of Marxism is what Leon Trotsky called the theory of the permanent revolution. The permanent revolution was first developed really in its very, very broad outline in comments written by Marx in terms of understanding the development of the class struggle and the impossibility of there being a move towards socialism without there being a struggle by the working people. Now, it was Trotsky who observed, on the basis of the 1905 revolution in Russia, that really the mass of the ruling classes in Russia, already by 1905, the bourgeois, not only was very weak, but was tied hand and foot to the landowners, to the Tsarist regime, and to the old semi-feudal existence of pre-revolutionary Russia. And Trotsky observed in the period between September and December 1905 how the small capitalist class in Russia, which was hand and foot tied to imperialism, was unable to really challenge and carry through those historic tasks which traditionally were the tasks of capitalism. The task of creating a modern nation state, the elimination of feudal and semi-feudal relations on the land, the solution to the national question, and the creation of a bourgeois democracy. In October 1905, the capitalists in Russia marched alongside the workers demanding democracy. When concessions were granted by the Tsarist regime, the capitalists began to step back, and in the November 1905 strikes, the capitalists were on the sidelines, looking nervous, looking at the way that this movement for democracy was already spilling over into an economic and social movement where the workers were demanding more rights in the factories, trade union rights, the need for political expression, and so on. A month later, a third great strike movement developed in Russia in December of 1905. This time, the capitalists, far from being on the sidelines looking nervously, were standing behind the Tsar saying, "Put this movement down. It is a dangerous movement. It is a movement that is going beyond what we wish." And in that struggle, and of course Marxism is very concrete. Marxists study events in order to learn lessons from them. In the struggle of 1905 was revealed the inability of this small, weak capitalist class to challenge the old feudal regime in Russia. And therefore, it was Trotsky who drew the conclusion most clearly that the motor forces in the Russian Revolution, the forces that will propel social change and economic change, had to come from the working class, that it would be the working class which would be able to overthrow the old feudal society, bringing behind it the poor peasantry, but in doing so, that inevitably would pose the question of whether you could stop at the obtaining of a bourgeois democracy or whether you would have to go forward. And for Trotsky, the question was answered by events when it became clear that it would not be possible for the working class to lead a social and economic struggle to obtain the bourgeois democratic rights and then give them back to a bourgeois which was too weak and already tied hand and foot to imperialism. Trotsky said, well, the working class must go further. The working class must carry through the social revolution itself. Now, there were many discussions within the ranks of the Russian Social Democratic and Labour Party between 1905 and 1917 on exactly what permutation was necessary between the working class and the peasantry to bring about the solving of the democratic tasks in Russia. But by April 1917, by Lenin's arrival in Russia, the differences that had existed historically, where Lenin had, for instance, put a much more cautious formula of the democratic dictatorship of the proletariat and peasantry, but by which he meant, nevertheless, that it should be the forces of labour, the hands of toil, that should take the struggle forward and not trust to the bourgeois, of course. But by 1917, the question was posed, and extraordinarily important lessons were drawn from the 1917 revolution. Firstly, that in a backward country like Russia, it was only the working class, organized through a revolutionary Marxist party, that could have the program and have the economic and social cohesion to bring about not just the overthrow of the old regime, but lay the foundations for the new revolution, the workers' state itself. It became clear as well that the role of the peasantry in this process, although very important, nevertheless could not in and of itself be decisive. Trotsky explained many times, both before 1917 and in his struggles with the Stalinists afterwards, that the peasantry as a class cannot play an independent political role. By its very nature, by its lack of cohesion and so on, the peasantry has a very limited consciousness, but can be swung behind the proletariat around concrete questions of land to the peasants, of bread and freedom and so on, but only if the working class has a Marxist organization, has a Marxist party and a Marxist method, and on that basis the forces that gave birth to the Russian Revolution were very, very clear. Now I make these points not in order to take away from the importance of the situation in Cuba or to digress, but because they are absolutely central to our understanding of what subsequently happened in Cuba itself. By the way, you know, in Cuba, the working class constituted 40%, in Cuba, only 42% of the people in 1959 worked on the land. The working class, as a socially cohesive class, was stronger relatively in Cuba in 1959 than had been the case in Russia in 1917. But nevertheless, the form the revolution took was very different from the form the revolution took in 1917 and itself. Lenin and Trotsky, as I've said, had stressed the importance of the leading role of the working class, even in countries where the working class in absolute terms was a minority of the population. What happened in Cuba was a peculiar combination of circumstances which saw the coming to power in 1959 of a movement, the July the 26th movement, led not by the proletariat, not by the working class, and not by the conscious force of a Marxist party, but by a peasant guerrilla struggle, which primarily based itself upon the rural workers and the landless and the peasants, and which moreover did not have a conscious Marxist attitude. And I'll go on to talk about that in a moment. And so therefore the first question to pose is how could a revolution in Cuba take such a different form than the Russian Revolution? What are the reasons for the circumstances of the revolution in 1959? Well, first of all, as I'll explain, the Batista regime by 1959 was really hollowed out. It had no social reserves in society as a military dictatorship responsible for the killing of nearly 100,000 people in the previous few years. That regime was repellent to the mass of Cubans who yearned for change. Secondly, the anger within society towards the Batista regime, which was so clearly incapable of taking Cuba forward, of carrying out any of the bourgeois democratic tasks that had been explained by Trotsky many years previously, even began to infect the army. Sections of the army themselves were of the view that under Batista, Cuba was in a dead-end situation. And in fact, the guerrilla movement of Castro and Che actually succeeded in winning over many rank-and-file soldiers and even some officers. In Cuba, none of the opposition to Batista was being channeled through the Cuban Communist Party. The Cuban Communist Party had, prior to this, supported the Batista regime, had called the Batista regime a positive regime in some ways, and therefore the Cuban Communist Party was not positioned centrally in the struggle of the people as the party which represented the struggle itself. And all these factors had led to a political vacuum in Cuba, into which the proponents of the July 26 movement, because of their audacity, because of the struggle they were prepared to wage, were able to take hold of and develop. Now, to go back a moment, because some chronology is, of course, necessary if you're not familiar with the way events unfolded. The Cuban Communist Party, as I say, in line with its sister parties across the world, was still tied to the Stalinist position of stages, that it was necessary to have an alliance with the so-called progressive national bourgeoisie. You would search long and hard in Cuba to find a progressive bourgeoisie prior to 1959, but that didn't stop the Stalinists trying very, very hard. And therefore, when in 1952, Batista came to power in a second coup, many of the intellectuals in Cuba, many of the young students in Cuba, repelled by the coming to power of this dictatorship, were not automatically drawn towards the Cuban Communist Party. On the contrary, they had a very inchoate view of what was necessary beyond thinking that change was necessary.